Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday. It's Sunday, December the 16th, if I'm not wrong. Is that correct? 16th?
17th.
17th. Thank you, Alice. Sunday, December 17th, both here and in Israel. Here it's about 9:03 a.m. and Michael has already spent half his day up. It's 4 o'clock over there. And we're very pleased that you're with us for part two of our TBS Israel Committee sponsored series, October 6th, 7th, and 8th, and moving forward. This is part two. We are going to focus today on a number of things, especially related to the events of October 7th. We are honored once again to have Mike Hollander with us. We have almost a 100% retention from session one, which is a good sign, Michael, that you were effective in session number one. So without further ado, it's great to spend a Sunday morning with all of you before we go to football games and go shopping and stay inside and get out of this weather and hope for better weather. But at this point, Michael, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. And if there's a problem, I'm going to see when I share my screen who comes up, and then I'll ask you if there's a problem to wave and tell me that why can I not see what I want to see up here? Yeah. Okay. Wave and tell me that you can't see it, but all right. There we go. Anyway, I can see who was that first? Vanessa, I can see you. So Vanessa, if I chop out, just give me a thumbs up and I'll move downstairs and I'll take a break or whatever. So welcome to Chapter 2, which I focused on, as Mark and I entitled it, A Moment in Time, Israel on October 6, 2023. The same icons as last week, so those of you are here. And our next session, by the way, Mark, is in January, if I remember, correct? Next year. So, I was thinking about where we were on October 6th. There's no question that there were three main events that had happened in the past year that informed where we were on that Friday evening, Simchat Torah, just after the end, the last day of Sukkot, exactly 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, continuing or kind of on the coattails. And those of you, I know the rest of us who were here in the summer, some of you others might have been here as well, that kind of euphoria, excitement, disbelief, celebration of Israel's 75th anniversary. So I'm going to talk about those two events, and then I'm going to talk a lot more about what happened in the year leading up to October 7th of this year. Of course, it all begins 75 years ago in Tel Aviv. Israel, there's independence, right along Rothschild Boulevard, and that really changes Jewish reality from a position of being literally the objects of everybody else's history to being the subjects of our own story. Here you can see some of the signatories. Golda, of course, that is real Golda. That is not Helen Mirren. I just want to make sure there's no confusion. Ben Gurion, our first foreign minister, Moshe Sharet on the right, and that image on the right there is the Declaration of Independence, which is there for a reason, because that became a symbol and was constantly spread and carried in like huge form in the protests against the judicial overhaul, which I'll be talking about later on today. Yom Kippur War, again, don't read all the text. These are slides from a previous presentation, but keep in mind, and some of you, you might remember leading up to 1970. In the Middle East, American Secretary of State Kissinger, who just passed away, asked President of Egypt, Sadat, hey, would you be willing to agree to peace with Israel in return for Sinai? Never got a response. Intelligence comes in early October.
Mike, you're getting choppy. Mike, you're getting choppy.
Massive movements of Egyptians today on Friday, October 6th. A limited mobilization. All right, a limited mobilization of reserves. And with that, I'm going to take you all downstairs. Sorry, got to do this, but I'll see you in a minute. You get a tour of the house. Just a moment. Hopefully, if you see any distraction, it'll be my lovely wife, Michelle, and she is very busy baking chocolate chip cookies. Why? Because our son is home from reserve duty for a couple days, and he's vegan, which he's vegetarian. Yeah, he's vegetarian. So he doesn't eat the meat. Most parents send back schnitzel and meat to soldiers on the front, but since our youngest isn't, here I'll show you the situation room up close and personal. There's Michelle, don't smile, but there you can see the chocolate chip cookies. A little distraction. while I get to a better internet connection. Sorry a second.
Also, we could try muting our videos, turning off our video screens for a little while you're doing the bulk of the presentation. That might actually help preserve bandwidth. If people can, it might help.
I'm also right now like physically 4 inches away from my my what's it called, from my device, so it should be a lot better now. Anyway, what happens? It seems on 2 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday, Yom Kippur, Golda Meir, Prime Minister, announces that the Egyptians and Syrians came a massive artillery, massive air force, and armored corps across the border, and already by that day, by the next day, Moshe Dayan, at the time the defense minister, warns that this could lead to the destruction of the very destruction of Israel. So this is exactly 50 years ago, October 6th. And, you know, we commemorate Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur, the day after Yom Kippur, obviously, in Israel. But it was very, you know, palpably in the air, the sense that, oh, it was exactly 50 years ago. And you can see what happens in May. Secretary of State Kissinger negotiates. Israel manages actually to get quite a bit on the right. You can see a little bit better on the map on the right-hand side. Quite a bit of territory, the dark brown, into Syria in the war. And you can see Israel, which is made up of the yellow, the 49 to 67 borders, or 48 to 67, the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai, captured by Egypt in the Six-Day War, as well as the Golan Heights. But the dark brown at the top is the area that the Israel Defense Forces actually penetrated closer to Damascus during the war in 1973. Kissinger negotiated a disengagement, and you can see the purple area became this demilitarized zone between Israel and Syria. Some of the images, just because I already had them put here anyway, of David Elazar. What's amazing you see on the left-hand side is an American airplane, and one of the most important events, the decorated General Ariel Sharon, later, we'll see later, will actually become quite a contested and conflicted figure in the Israeli military and then in the political sphere, of course. But for the first time, when the Yom Kippur War marked, Golda and the Commander-in-Chief David Elazar, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, what the 73 war symbolized, many things. First of all, there was a huge number, 3,000 Israelis killed. Many were prisoners of war. And unfortunately, we now know 72 days into war, there's still over 100, maybe 130, mostly civilians who were prisoners in Gaza, held by Hamas. And the problem that Israel realized after the war was that Israel was very much guilty of what's called in Hebrew the conceptia, the concept, the failed notion that there was no reason that the Arab countries would attack us again. Why? We had defeated 3 of them in 6 days. There's a commission of inquiry set up after the war, led by the Justice Shimon Agranat. And in that commission, they declare in red, the IDF, the chiefs, held that the concept that Egypt wouldn't attack without sufficient air power to attack in depth and to dislocate the Israeli Air Force, and the Syria wouldn't attack without Egypt. Well, guess what? We were deadly wrong. 3,000 people, and ultimately the Commander-in-Chief David Elazar was the one who was found culpable. He was forced to move aside. Golda Meir resigned shortly thereafter. And one of the main consequences of the war, I talked about this when if you've been with me to Israel after the 67 war, was the American involvement. President Nixon, not because he was a big lover of Jews or a Zionist, but Nixon supplies Israel with weapons in response to the Soviet resupply of Syria and Egypt. The Labor Party begins to lose. Yitzhak Rabin becomes prime minister eventually. But what happened was, this is from Martin Gilbert's History of Israel, is that we began to realize there was a growing dependence on many levels on the United States. It led to a rupture in a lot of our relations in the Third World. It created, more than anything else, the psychological breakthrough which allowed Israel to give up in a few years' time on give up the Sinai Peninsula for peace with Egypt. It led to the kind of weaponization of oil as a tool of the OPEC countries. We all remember lining up in gas stations in 1973. And it had profound internal consequences because of the perceived misunderstanding, not perceived, but the misunderstanding of the Israeli leadership led by the Labor government. And eventually, 4 years later, indeed, the political hegemony of the Labor Party was ended when Menachem Begin's Likud party took over. So that's one two pieces so far that are relevant to where we were on October 6th. One is we just coming out of celebrating our 75th anniversary, miraculous as it was then, and it continues to be. And two, we were just very reflective and very kind of internalized over what happened in 1973 and the kind of falling into this false sense of security, wrongly, of course, that led to too many fatalities and too many casualties. Fast forward about 12 years in Lebanon, and you'll see why I talk about this now. Lebanon was a country that never really functioned, established by the French after the First World War and the demise of the Ottoman Empire. But in 1985, after Israel had already been in Lebanon for 2.5 years and had kicked out the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, a new organization called Hezbollah. The idea of Shiite clerics, not Sunni, but the minority in Islam, who studied in Iran, inspired by the revolution of Khomeini in 1979, they organized a group, and through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, IRGC, which you hear about a lot in the news, they set up an organization which ultimately today functions as a state within a state. They're legitimate political organization. They have about 10% of the seats in the parliament, in the Majlis, and sit in the governing coalition. And one of the main components of Lebanon in the past 40 years has been that Hezbollah, which has its primary goal of the elimination of the state of Israel, plays a prominent role politically. And its manifesto says quite clearly, like Hamas, our struggle will end only when this entity is obliterated. Now, to clarify, there is no argument between Israel and Lebanon over the border. There's no outstanding issue. We've just never made peace with that country. And today that country is, I won't say dominated, but is heavily influenced by this organization, funded by Iran, which is seen as a terror organization by your country, obviously by Israel. They were the ones responsible for the deaths of hundreds of US Marines in Beirut in the 1980s. And in the civil war in Syria, led by the leader Hassan Nasrallah, who's celebrating his birthday in a bunker. He's actually been in a bunker pretty much since 2006, the last major Israeli war in Lebanon. But they were very involved in the Syrian civil war. Now, why am I giving you all of this background? You'll see, because there is Nasrallah. During COVID, he came out and he had a press conference from his underground bunker, and he was coughing. And the Israeli, commentators in the news were like, "Oh, this must mean that Nasrallah has COVID, and let's wish him that hopefully he can't get the medication that he needs because he's got all sorts of medical issues, but he's still thriving, unfortunately." And if you look at this map, just the colors give you a bit of a sense how Lebanon, this artificial entity created by the French in the First World War, is today a country that is ethnically and religiously divided amongst 6 major and then many other smaller groups. Today, the largest community, but not the majority, 40+%, we think, are Shiites. These are the minority in Islam. Iran and Iraq are Shiite majorities. Today, you can't say Lebanon is a Shiite majority because they're less than half the population, but the largest religious and ethnic group in Lebanon is Shiites. And where do they live? Mostly close to the border of Lebanon and up here in the Baalbek in the valley and the Mount Lebanon. Very involved, and it's connected. Once again, this picture I put up there from a couple of years ago already. There's an event in Lebanon. There's the Hezbollah flag. There's the American flag for people to step on next to the Israeli flag. And they're raising money for the children of Yemen. Why? Because, as you know, your tax-paying dollars are funding American aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf and in the Mediterranean that just yesterday shot 14 drones sent from Yemen toward Israel. Go figure. So you've got the Hezbollah threat on Lebanon, and Hezbollah, let it be known, has a much greater arsenal, much more powerful, much more numerous, much more accurate, the ability of carrying, much higher quantities of explosives, can target much more precisely all across Israel. So this is the range, intelligence tells us, within Israel, and the size of the rockets that can go 185 miles, which is the length of all of Israel, and can even get down to what could be a nuclear facility down here. I'm just saying it could be, we don't know. But there is little Gaza Strip, and there is Lebanon. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah has, we think, 150,000 or more rockets. Now, like in Lebanon, where do they keep their rockets? Here is a friend of mine who runs an education and a research institute up in the Galilee. And Israeli military intelligence, by looking at these, give you a bit of a sense how all of these red and blue spots are all spots where there are rockets and there are weapon supplies in southern Lebanon. And just like Hamas is entrenched within the civilian population, and just like Hamas uses human shields, so too is Hezbollah, which started like Hamas as a social welfare organization, and then it became a political organization, and we all know it as a terror organization whose primary aim is not even to take over Lebanon, but to ensure the removal of the state of Israel, working obviously in cahoots as a proxy agent of Iran. Now it's confusing because Shiites, the Hezbollah are Shiites and Hamas and Gaza are Sunnis, but until October 6th, the threat that most Israelis felt most was the threat from Lebanon, okay? Because the number of weapons that they had. Now, in midst of all of this, leading up to where we were on October 6th, was this incredible internal division within Israeli society. We had 5 elections from April 2019 until November 2022. That's me, is my wife. You just met the baker of the great chocolate chip cookies, and her daughter, voting in the elections on April 2019. And as you vote in elections in Israel, I should say, you wait outside the ballot box. You have your little piece of paper which shows that you're eligible to vote that comes to your address, your house, a couple months before the election. You then go with your photo ID to the polling station. While you're waiting outside, there's a list of all of the parties. There were like 50 in the last election. And then you go into the booth, and you'll see in the next election, so 5 months later, because there wasn't a clear enough victor who was able to form a government, there are fewer parties in this election in 2018. That's me. I'm casting ballot inside this box. I've gone behind here and I've taken the slip of paper for the party that I support and I put it in the box. September 2019, we did not have conclusive results from that election as well. So we've now had 2 elections, April and September. You know what happens in 2020? In January, former President Trump signs this Abraham Accord, an amazing initiative. I'm not going to say where it started necessarily, but amazing effort to try to resolve the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians, 2 major voices rejected that. One were the Palestinians themselves, and 2 were the Jews who live in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, who said, this doesn't make any sense. You're suggesting here there's going to be an Arab state. How are we going to connect 500,000 Jews living inside of the West Bank? So that happens in January 2020. The government still has not formed. And 2 months later, we go to a 3rd election in 11 months. Now, one would think that if the prime minister was on the coattails of this amazing, unprecedented agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and later on Morocco, and later on maybe Sudan, and maybe in the future Oman, and maybe in the future Saudi Arabia. There is Michelle, my wife, voting again at elections. There she is, happy. I don't know why she's happy, because she's voting for the 3rd time. But, you know, it was a day off. There am I voting for elections. And I remember exactly when the elections happened, because 3 days later, COVID struck. And I last guided March 5th, and then nobody was allowed into the country for about 2 years. What happened in these elections? All of a sudden, we've now had 3 elections in a year, in 11 months. There is uncertainty, but there is something called COVID. And this man on the left, Benny Gantz, head of a party that received 33 seats in the election, decided to form a coalition with Prime Minister Netanyahu and form a national emergency government. When he did that, he lost about half of his 33 seats to parties that ran on a ticket with him, but said, we can't sit with the Prime Minister, Netanyahu that is, and so they left. The government lasted until the end of the year, until there was a disagreement and Netanyahu fired his coalition partners, and ultimately we had to go to another elections. But we're not there yet, because from January and the elections in March and the coalition in February, all of a sudden by the summer, we're signing in Washington, formalizing the treaty between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain. Uganda then joined, Saudi Arabia joined, and our prime minister said, this is a new era, an era of true peace, a peace that is expanding with other Arab countries, 3 of them in recent weeks, Morocco and Israel, Kuwait, Qatar, and it was spreading all across the Middle East. Your Secretary of State Pompeo announces a new arms deal to the Emirates. There is our prime minister, your president at the time, the representative, he wasn't the prime minister of Bahrain, the president or prime minister, I think, of the Emirates. Amazing moment once again, as we experienced in 1977 when Sadat came to Israel, when we signed peace with Jordan, and all of a sudden the map of the Middle East began to change. This is in the summer of 2020. We've got COVID, yes, but we've also got now relations with Egypt, peace with Jordan, now the Emirates, now Bahrain. What about Saudi Arabia? What about Kuwait? And all of a sudden things were looking quite up in the Middle East. The perception, interestingly enough, in the Arab, and this is something that's really important to understand what's happening today, what happened since October 7th, what has always happened in this part of the world. And that is, what we see isn't necessarily what other people see. So the Arab Street, as you can see in this newspaper in the Emirates, Israel freezes Palestinian annexation for ties with the Emirates. In other words, the perception in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, was that the good news from us is that we've stopped the Prime Minister Netanyahu's plan to annex on the coattails of the Abraham Accords part of the West Bank and make that permanently part of Israel. Now, that led to a rupture between our prime minister and your president at the time. But the nuance is very, very, very important, because what were the Palestinians thinking? As all of a sudden across the Middle East, look at the colors, right? Look at this map on the right, forget the one on the left. All the green are countries that either Israel has peace with or has unofficial relations with. It's a new Middle East. But Morocco, we're signing agreement with Morocco. All of a sudden, the walls of the old city are lit up with the flag of Israel in Morocco. And so we've got this amazing development of more and more relations with countries in the Middle East. But the Palestinians are saying, but what about us? So you've got 75 years of independence in 2023. You've got 50 years in October of 2023 since the Yom Kippur War. You've got the spread of more peace and more relations, including potentially with Saudi Arabia in the summer and early fall of 2023. And you have the Palestinians saying, what about us? Very important to understand what happens on October 7th in that context as well. Internally within Israel, we have continued protests, which, if you ask me, explain why Netanyahu was unable to form a government. These are protests, committed Israelis with Israeli flags, in front of the residence of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem. They're protesting over the fact that he is in government as prime minister, even though he's in court for 3 criminal trials. How can you govern and be in court? Doesn't make any sense. Loads and loads of protests, which ultimately, I believe, led to his inability to form a government. And as this is happening, keep in mind, Israelis, and you all know this as Jews, are a very passionate people. And bizarre as this might sound, there's a vast majority, 70% of Israelis actually believe that protests can influence government's policies. I don't have time in my presentation today to talk about that, but over decades, many protests, the protest in 2006 to 2011 to free Gilad Shalit, one Israeli prisoner taken by Hamas in Gaza in exchange for 1,027 prisoners. People believe in the power of protests on the street. We've got Israel's success in being the first nation to vaccinate against COVID, end of 2020. We've got the spread of the Abraham Accords, but yet the prime minister cannot govern. And we go to a 4th election in March of 2021, which was unprecedented because for the first time ever, our government was formed by 8 governments across the spectrum. The most diverse government we've ever had. 3 parties of the left, including an Arab party led by Mansour Abbas, the gentleman on the right, and 3 parties on the right, and 2 in the center, led by Yair Lapid. Amazing, unprecedented government that lasts. A guy who is kind of a symbol of the center left is on the right in the picture, Yair Lapid, and Naftali Bennett, a symbol of the religious right, joining a government of national unity, a government of what Bennett, first-term prime minister, said was a government of 70-30. There's 70% of the issues that we agree on, let's focus on those, and we're not going to focus on the 30% of the issues that we do not agree upon. That lasts unprecedentedly, and it's crazy to think of who's sitting who. This guy on the right in the picture is on the far left, and this guy on the left in the picture is on the far right. I mean, politically, not in the picture. And it lasted for 10 months. In this period, there's a big question of who we are as a people internally. We're 75 years almost right? We're leading up to the 75th celebration in the spring of 2023. Here's a government. Where are we? Are we more traditionally Jewish? Are we, as our president said a number of years ago, divided into tribes, into groups based on where our kids go to school, right? In 2015, President Rivlin, at that time, said that our problem in Israel is that we're divided because we go to 4 different educational systems: the secular school, the national religious school, the ultra-Orthodox, the Arab schools, and the ultra-Orthodox schools. The divisions within Israeli society, he warned, were getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And in many ways, one of the big challenges that we were facing leading up to our 75th anniversary was, if it seems that peace is breaking out on all fronts, maybe with Saudi Arabia next, on all corners simultaneously, maybe now we have that responsibility to focus internally on how we wanted to understand who we were as a society, right? For many years, the glue that held us together was the external threat. And now the challenge is, how do you come, positively and figure out who we are as Israeli society? We all know that we celebrated Israel as one of the greatest technology centers in the world, startup nation. And the headlines and the number of companies in Israel and the number of multinationals, almost 400 companies from Google and Yahoo and Microsoft and everyone is here investing in Israel because of its unbelievable rich human capital. Huge deals coming out, ambassadors being exchanged. This is our friend was the ambassador to Bahrain. The prime minister goes to Bahrain, right? Massive deals, right? $5.4 billion. Israel was really sailing toward what we thought was this new era in our 76th year. But the Palestinians didn't share that optimism. Remember, in the 90s, Gaza was divided, as was the West Bank, into areas of jurisdiction, Jewish or Israeli controlled, Palestinian controlled, and shared. And in those 5 years of 95 to 2000, Israel withdrew from many areas of Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority went in. In Gaza, as I said last week, for those of you who were there, Israel withdrew in 2005 from all of Gaza. But if you look at the map in the West Bank, this is a map from a left-of-center not-for-profit called Peace Now Shalom Achshav. And in their map, you can see that dark colors are the areas under Palestinian control, and the light colors, the areas under Israeli control. And you can see it's a very, very complicated map, to say the least. And in the West Bank live about a little bit shy 500,000 Jews and about 2.8, close to 3 million Palestinians. And as peace was developing around Israel, the Palestinian voice on the street was getting louder and louder, saying, but what about us? How can the Saudis sign a deal and normalize with Israel if they're not worried about us? And they're not saying, as they had for 75 years almost, we will only sign a deal with Israel when they normalize with the Palestinians or when there is a Palestinian independent state. What was happening? Our government was not prioritizing the question of whether there should be a two-state solution or not. Some ideas like the Geneva Initiative said, look, most of the area of the West Bank will be a future state of Palestine, and Israel will be Israel, and hopefully we can have a two-state solution. But that was on the back burner as well. What was happening with that question? Back to the Northern Front. I've been a number of times in the past year along the border with Lebanon, and where you see these blue and yellow tunnels are where there were almost a dozen Hezbollah tunnels found in end of 2018, beginning of 2019, or maybe 1920, by Israel Defense Forces that were dug underground in order to get into Israel, in order, we thought, and this was the greatest threat, that what Hezbollah was going to do is they were going to launch thousands of rockets toward us, and then they'd have a group of soldiers who would penetrate, right? There's the fence. This is Israel. It's a picture I took from my phone. This is the border. That's Lebanon on the ridge. And underground, deep, deep underground, that's my hand, to put it in context, that is a drill bit. It's about a foot wide, maybe 10, 12 inches wide, that is used to dig a tunnel under very, very hard stone bedrock. This is the tunnel, one of them, the dozen or so that were discovered, that goes down, again, pictures from my phone, that goes down. How far does it go down? 79 meters. I've walked about this far. 79 meters is about 26 stories. That's how deep the tunnel is. And Hezbollah workers spent years building these tunnels from Lebanon, digging them. I don't know, this is about 500 meters, so a quarter of a mile or so, a little more than a quarter of a mile from Lebanon, under the border, and then coming upwards, whose aim, as I said, was in order to allow people to actually get out, come through those tunnels, come into Jewish communities, and maybe hold off a Jewish settlement. That was the biggest military threat that Israelis felt by October 6th, 2023. But just before that, we go to another election, election number 5. Because as I said, that unprecedented 8-party across-the-board right-left coalition didn't last too long. There's Michelle. Looks like a deja vu again, because it's the 5th picture of her voting. There's my finger picking my piece of paper to put it into the ballot box, and we had elections. The thing about the elections were that they were not about Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. The elections were about whether Netanyahu was fit to run to be prime minister again. Ultimately, in the elections, the prime minister was able to form a coalition with a narrow victory of about 30,000 votes, and the government is voted in. It's the prime minister's 6th time as prime minister, and it's his 16th year as prime minister. Now, in his first cabinet meeting, he said there are 4 main aims of my government. One is to block Iran. 2 is to restore the security and governance within Israel, so internal security. 3, to deal with the cost of living and housing. And 4, to dramatically expand the circle of peace. That's where we were when the new government is formed. And here you can see the pictures, the numbers, a little bit clearer if you want. And you'll notice on the right-hand side, there we have all these figures. To the left is the government, 64, and all of these parties on the right, it should be the other way around, are the parties in the opposition. And we have 4 major parties: Netanyahu's party, a national religious far-right party, and 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, forming a coalition, sailing into the early days of 2023, 5-6 months before our independence. And in January, a week after the new government is elected, the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, announces a judicial overhaul. And I quote, "We go to the polls," this was the Justice Minister, "we vote, elect, and time after time, people we didn't elect choose for us. Many sectors of the public look to the judicial system and do not find their voices heard." That is not democracy. What happens? It's not mentioned as one of the 4 aims of the government, but within a week, the Prime Minister sanctions his Justice Minister to create this judicial overhaul. By July, after a protest, I'll show you some pictures in just a minute, the government passes by 64-0, because the opposition left the parliament. They said, we're not going to be party to this. And the text of the law is as follows. In spite of what is stated in this basic law, those holding judicial power by law, including the Supreme Court, shall not hear nor issue an order against the government, the prime minister, or government minister on the reasonableness of their decision. In this section, decision means any decision, etc. In other words, the judicial overhaul's first main legislation said that the Supreme Court is no longer able, because it's made up of appointed justices rather than elected members of parliament, to overrule any ruling or appointment by the Knesset. And from January until October 1st, I think, or whatever it was, September 30th, were massive, massive protests. Every single Saturday night, here's the pictures in Tel Aviv, hundreds of thousands of Israelis, up to maybe 500,000 or 600,000 a week. A lot of people in the high tech were very opposed to this. These are just some pictures I took of myself. This one, obviously, on the left, I didn't, was from the internet. Have I lost you all? What happened here? Sorry, you don't want that one. And all of a sudden, in March, what happens is there's internal division within the government. And the defense minister at that time says publicly, maybe we should press pause. The prime minister fired him. And that evening, hundreds of thousands of people spontaneously went out to the street and blocked the main highway in Tel Aviv. There's my son on the right, walking out to the protest. And just in case I didn't put my political cards on the table, that's me, that's my wife, with an image of Theodore Herzl. I'm crying over what was happening with the state of Israel. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the slogans, the catchiest of which rhymes, in Hebrew says Yariv and Machriv. Yariv on the right is the first name of the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, and on the left, Machriv is destroyer. Now, why am I giving you all of this background? I want you to understand, and with this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, where Israel was on October 6th. On the one hand, and I've got lots of hands here, we were euphoric over the fact that we've been here and we've succeeded in growing our country population-wise, economically, creatively wise, phenomenally, miraculous, almost 10 million people in 75 years. On the other hand, we were coming out of realizing that we were, for lack of a better word, cocky in October of 1973. We were caught with our pants down. We didn't read the intelligence correctly that was coming in. And we paid a very, 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 very heavy price. And in the year or two leading up to the 75th anniversary and the 50th anniversary of Yom Kippur, the divisions within Israel began to grow deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, always having security concerns. Yes, Hamas in Gaza. Yes, of course, Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. But most significantly, militarily, the concern was Hezbollah with those tunnels that I showed you, but also the internal division within Israel that got so deep that those who were the biggest proponents of the judicial overhaul or the change to the adjustment to the judicial system were suggesting that the protesters were nothing more than anarchists and self-hating Jews and anti-Zionists, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, there are many of those reasons why October 7th happened that you've heard of in the news that are connected to what I've tried to bring across in the past half hour or so. And that is the sense from the Palestinians, in particular Hamas, that they were not happy, that there was going to be another step in the normalization between the Arab world and Israel without significant advance to the Palestinians. There was a recognition in Hamas that Israel's over-reliance on technology and startup nation could be a weakness militarily. The internal divisions within Israel, where a number of reservists, particularly pilots, were refusing to serve because of the proposed judicial overhaul. And all of these were, I think, elements that were necessary to understand where we were on October 6th, just before October 7th at 6:29 a.m. And with that, I have a couple minutes for questions. And hopefully the reception was better. It was better, Vanessa? You could see it?
Much better, Michael. And Michael, I can tell you that in June, Rabbi Pomerantz and a nice group from Temple Beth Shalom was with you, a full disclosure. And on this Saturday night, we were in Jerusalem after the bar bat mitzvah celebration. I know Rabbi Pomerantz went with some of the participants, and I went to outside the president's house. And it was really such a special, emotional event for me to be, and I would imagine Rabbi's on the conference call too, for her as well. And I'm not sure if, I know Vanessa and Gary were there. I'm not sure if they'd gone to one, but the feeling of being part of it, and just so my question is, the feeling of the country at the time, was there at any point any hope for optimism because of what was going on with the judicial reform crisis?
Well, my answer is yes. I would meet every Saturday, and when I met with a couple colleagues of mine in Modin, right near where I live in the middle of Israel, and the justice minister lives in town. And at the beginning, there were protests outside of his apartment. But then his mother died, and he was sitting Shiva, so we moved it to the center of town. I was happy because it's a block away. I didn't have to drive there, so it was nice. But I would say to my friends every Saturday, I says, God, this is crazy. Every Saturday we're coming out to protest. But one day, my son, the one who's a reservist now in the Air Force, he came up. He came back from a CrossFit class. He's all schwitzing. He comes up to me and he calls me. He says, "I'm here. Is it still happening?" So he came for the last 5 minutes. He's holding a flag. I'm holding a flag, and we sing Hatikva. And he says, "I'm glad I'm here." And that sense of committed Israelis. Think of most social protests in most of the world. They burn the flags. Here we don't. We end singing Hatikva, the hope. And I think what happened was there was a coalescence, if that's a word in English, of people from the moderate left and the moderate right and everybody in between. And I began to believe that the critical mass of Israelis are in the middle. You know what the columnist Amos Etzel used to say in the Jerusalem Post, Middle Israel. And that, I believed, was the biggest constituency, and hopefully would find a leader that would lead us into the future. And the far left and far right, kind of like in America, wouldn't be the ones creating the agenda. So that was my optimism. And that optimism, unfortunately, was strengthened post-October 7th. Because in absence, and again, I'm putting my political cards on the table, but in absence of good governance and competent governance, which we're still experiencing today, I'm speaking to you as someone who has to deal with a 25-page document in order to get compensation from the government for unemployment, because I haven't worked since October 7th, crazy. But the government isn't functioning. The people of Israel are functioning. And in every possible way of volunteering and doing whatever is possible to help, you know, the war and the people who were evacuated, and it is phenomenal. And that positive energy and that sense of achva, you know, of camaraderie and togetherness is, I think, a great sense of optimism. So our politics may be, you know, crazy or whatever, we'll get beyond that. And hopefully we'll have a new leader in the not too distant future. But there is a tremendous amount of unity of purpose. And over 75 years, that ultimately is what has been our greatest moment of unity in times of threat and in times of war and in times of crisis. So I see there's another question. Rabbi, one of the questions, yes. So the question is, one of the questions many of us ask is why the military took so long to respond on October 7th. Grandparents were able to rescue their families on kibbutzim across the country before the military arrived. Well, to be fair, Rabbi, the grandparents who rescued their families were retired generals who were former commanders of the Southern Command and had a lot of pull and, you know, picked up some people along the way. But yes, the good news is that that question is to be answered in part 3, which is what happened on October 7th. But the short answer is, I will give you now, and that is that there was a reliance, as I said, like in 1973. You know, my son, a couple of weeks ago when he was home from reserves, he was watching Golda, an Israeli documentary, not the American version. And he said, God, it's just like today. I mean, this 25-year-old kid who's going back 50 years. Because the sense was that with the most sophisticated protection of cameras, of underground sensors to detect tunnels, of high-tech fences, they can be taken down by a bulldozer. A couple of snipers can shoot out cameras. And that's exactly what happened. We were caught because we didn't dare to believe that the intelligence that was coming in of what Hamas was training to do and what they were planning on doing and what they had actually practiced doing even, we kind of thought wasn't really meaningful because there's no way they would do it. And if you ask anybody in the intelligence community, and I'm not one of them, but I've heard a few of them speak, they will tell you that in our wildest dreams, we never thought that Hamas would send 3,000 terrorists to 22 different communities simultaneously while 3,500 rockets came over in that entire area. Because when rockets come over, what do? You go into your shelter. And it was those 10 minutes that everybody was in the shelter that ultimately Hamas was able, with as low tech as possible, to defeat fortress high-tech Israel. And temporarily, and this I've even talked about, but it's a clue of what I will talk about, temporarily take over for the first time, and I understand this, since the War of Independence, parts of sovereign Israel. Hamas successfully, for a couple days, controlled parts of what we think, or should be, sovereign Israel. Only time that's ever happened in our history since the War of Independence. With that, I can take probably one more question. Who is here? 2 new messages. Yeah, I see the same. Mark, you asked a similar question. Why are some ways this government, Rabbi Gale, could be dismantled before election? What are some of the ways? Good question. So, you know, I started by talking about what happened. The second piece was what happened in 1973, the Al Granat Commission set up after the Yom Kippur War. And ultimately, the commander-in-chief of the army has a responsibility. He's head of the Army and the Air Force and the Navy, of course, the Joint Chief of Staff equivalent. But ultimately, their role is to fulfill the role of the political echelon that makes the decision. So you can gather intelligence, you can make a recommendation, but it's ultimately the government that has to make a decision to declare war. And the tragedy was that the information in October and late September of 73 that was coming in was just misunderstood and misinterpreted and kind of downplayed because, seriously? We defeated 3 armies in 6 days. They're not going to attack us again. There was information, and you've seen it in American papers, and we've heard it in Israeli papers, that's come through. Intelligence information. Our neighbor, a young 19-year-old girl who sees things, that's her job. She watches what's going on the border and said, we saw things, but nobody really listened to us. So it's clear that it was a huge intelligence fiasco. And almost every leader, senior leader of the intelligence, the head of military intelligence, the commander-in-chief, Herzi Halevi of the IDF, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shabak, the General Security Service, all have said, we bear responsibility for what happened on October 7th. The one leader who we see almost daily on the news, our prime minister, has not said that yet. And I think there are many Israelis who, for him, he was, King Bibi, and he was the only one who could save us and protect us and have our economy grow, and has, in my humble opinion, in 16 years, taken full responsibility for all its successes, but has yet to take any responsibility for failure. The answer to that is, or the clue to that is, just 2 days ago, last night, he said, in a press conference, I was opposed to the Oslo Accords. Last week, he said there were as many people killed in one day on October 7th as were killed in the Second Intifada as a result of the Oslo Accords. So he's looking backwards and being critical of his predecessors rather than accepting responsibility for what happened. So in my opinion, and almost everybody I speak to in this country, the prime minister will not be prime minister, but not now. In other words, the war has to end. It would be too much of an internal, although I could say, if I were to meet him and say, Mike, Rabbi Gale asked, what do you think? I'd say, you need to step aside and appoint your defense minister, prime minister. I don't know, or Benny Gantz, prime minister, but he won't do that. He hasn't done that in 2.5 months, and he won't do that. And I think that this is the political end for Prime Minister Netanyahu, but I could be wrong. One never knows. Anyway, with that, I got to go. Are you there, Mark? All I can say is I can't say Happy Hanukkah anymore because it's over. Can I say Merry Christmas?
You could, but we just say whatever you want to say, Mike. Anyway, Michael, thank you for another wonderful session. The anticipation for our final part, January 8th, where you will bring us up to date on everything that continues to transpire and trying to understand what's going on. And you did that today. You did a great job in giving us some more background. We really appreciate you being with us. And we look forward to our next session on January 8th. We invite you tomorrow at 4 p.m., anyone on the chat, that we will have our Israel update. And again, anything that happened between now, there'll be big news, I would imagine, between now and tomorrow at 4 p.m., 11 your time, Mike, because something happens every day in Israel. And the news changes, every Monday we're together and we say, whatever happens today could be old news by next week because new things continue to happen. We're honored, Mike, to have you with us. We appreciate on behalf of Rabbi and our Israel committee and our chair, we thank you for being with us, and we look forward to our next session on January the 8th at 4 p.m. our time. Take care, everyone. I'm going to stop recording.
And good luck at the football game.
Shavuot Tov.
Shavuot
Thank
Tov.
you.
Shavuot Tov, everyone.